Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Mark, for making this happen, and thanks to Urbano, of course. And so excited to meet you all. I know it's still very fresh and you just started, but I think we're gonna have a lot of fun today, and I'm excited what we all come up together. And I think this is also kind of a time to experiment. There's no right or wrong. Like all everything is possible here, and the constraints are super open. And yeah, if you have any questions throughout, just feel free to ask or leave a message in the chat. We're happy to help you out or try to clarify if you don't understand anything. And yeah, this is really something we do all together, and I'm giving a brief intro into things I'm doing and things I'm interested in, and then we're going to do some little fun exercises. And we saw that you already placed amazing examples from your neighborhood typeface on Arena, and yeah, it looks awesome. I'm really excited. So yeah, a little bit to how this all came together. Mark and I had the pleasure to work together with Alex Kim, a friend of ours, at an issue that is called Paprika. It's basically a newspaper run by the students from the Yale School of Architecture. And for every issue, the team comes up with a topic. Our topic here was coal. And we were the editors for this issue and also the designers. And we got in touch with different students who wanted to write for this issue with this topic.
Well, Julia did most of it. Julia did most of the design, and Alex and I worked on just the big idea. And maybe I'll say just like the blurb. As editors, Alex and I and Julia, we presented what the theme would be, which was co. And there's a person named Vitruvius. He's a Roman author, architect, engineer from the 1st century BC, and he described collectivity coming from the discovery of fire. And we were really interested in that because if we look at that closer, we can think of the first act of collectivity not as like architecture and walls, but as like this huddled fire where people gather. And so we were questioning what that means today, is to construct a fire and collaborate. So this is a super fun project. I think there's another
slide. So that was one side. And kind of what we came up with were these objects or letters that had these eyes, these googly eyes, just as a form. We realized that the content was quite heavy. Like some of the topics that people wrote about were quite heavy. So we wanted to, with the design, to kind of emphasize kind of a contrast to that. And yeah, I think the conclusion of this was kind of really realizing that community requires an ongoing engagement, kind of both in the physical management of facilities, but also of a collective understanding of relationships and resources and identity. So it's kind of these things kind of influence each other. And yeah, that project led then, here you see some more of the shots. The idea was that it's kind of big, so if you read it, it almost like covers your face. So if you would read it in the subway, it would be kind of embarrassing. But that was kind of the point. That kind of led to another project that Mark and I worked on together for mutual aid here in Crown Heights, where Mark used to live and I live now. And you might have seen it in the description of the course, that poster, and these are some of the really early drafts, it also kind of shows that these things don't come just naturally, or we don't like, they don't come out like this. There is a long process, and it might start very, very simple and just like as literally a quick draft on a piece of paper. So here we had this idea of how can we show care, or how can we kind of, oh, I jump here once. One sec. How can we show care in a way that is friendly and welcoming? And so these were some of the ideas, like could it be like on top of the house of a snail? Could it be like a cushion? And sorry, I have to go back quick because I jumped that over. We also started to gather some other posters or printed matter that are related to community. And I think Mark has them on his Arena channels. You can also flip through that after. And we were just kind of interested in how, what kind of graphical language is used, what elements, what symbols. That was really inspiring. And yeah, then here's some more, like we were thinking, okay, could it actually be a snail? And the cops could be the kind of, I don't know the correct term for that, what comes out of a snail. But
Not sure either.
or things like that. We were thinking about, could it be something to do with sun and rain, or here I think that's a bit more clear here. So these were ideas that we were circling around, and then all of a sudden we thought, why can we basically not just return to that, what we like discovered here, and make these letters into characters that look for each other. And that's how the top part came to life. And then for the not cops, we wanted to go for something kind of more like little spooky, unpredictable. And that's basically, those were the two different typefaces or drawings, you could almost say illustrations, that we came up with. And then we had the pleasure to work with the risographer, you say riso, who then did these beautiful prints for us. And the mutual aid then was putting them up for, I don't know, $20 per piece, so they could fundraise.
Like
they could fundraise money, and that was really amazing to see that, or to think that, you know, people, we could do something good with those prints, and people actually really appreciated the effort.
Yeah, and I think it's just like worth mentioning that like not all the sketches are on the slide. So Julia and I were just like sketching back and forth, and every time Julia would come up with something, and it would like spark something in my head, and I would like try and respond to that. And so probably took like 50 drawings. Maybe each drawing just took like 5 seconds sometime just to like get it over and over. And then after many iterations, then we came to this.
Totally. Yeah, I think it's really about, we want to say with that it's things don't, we didn't end up with this, didn't came as like a first thing. It took like many steps to get there. And I have that sometimes, that I work on something and I go back to the first sketch and it was actually the best idea, which is funny to kind of keep record also of the things you do, and don't throw them in the bin, but take like a quick picture, or keep some sort of, keep documentation of the things you do, even though in the first place you feel like, oh, that's, you know, it's not a good idea, it doesn't look how I want it. But keeping track of things is really helpful. It can be helpful in the process. Yeah, I'm going to jump into some a project I did now already almost 2 years ago. That basically started with a book that I found in the library called Eye Movement and Vision. It's by a Russian psychologist called Alfred Yarbus. And he discovered some fundamental patterns of our visual behavior that he described in this book. So basically, what you see here is these two pictures on the top. And then below these little drawings you see is basically someone's eye movement recorded while looking at these images on the top. So what you see here, the more dots and lines you see, the more the person was looking there. So I think it was recorded for like a couple of seconds. So the people would see that would have a printout of this image, and then the eye tracking, it's a device that basically measures or looks at your pupils very, very precisely. And what you see here is basically that recording of the movement of the eye. So I found that really fascinating. And there's some, in the book, there's some more experiments that he did where, for example, he had people look at shapes. And what you see here is that the line, the result of how they looked at these shapes, it's never a straight line. So what happens with the eyes, he found out, is that the eye constantly jumps around. It's never static. It always does little, really, really quick movements that we can barely see if we look into someone's eyes. And what he found out, what is fascinating, is that he realized that people tend to look at high contrast images, or at the high contrast in an image first, or at things like mouth and eyes. So we're drawn to things that we're drawn to look at people. Basically, we're drawn to look at people's faces. And also in an image, we also try to figure out, or we try to find the story of the image or the explanation, which is, I think, is also fascinating. So with that in mind, I found a eye tracking lab at Yale in New Haven. And it's a lab for autism studies. And they figured out that children with autism also look very different. They move through the world very differently. And that was a lab that studied that effect of autism onto the way of looking, the way of moving through the world. So I was lucky there to try this eye tracker, which you see here on the left. It's this little machine that is placed in front of the chair that I was sitting on, and I had to place this really funny sticker on my forehead that measured the distance to the tracker. So if I would move, it would also record that. So what I did basically is I was looking at different letters. And now basically here I'm starting with the cover. I compiled this all, but I was looking at, maybe I can show that quickly here. I was looking at an existing alphabet. So on the screen were actually letters in the first exercise. In the second exercise, I was cutting out parts of the letter. So I had to finish the letter with my eyes. And in the very last part, I basically was looking at a blank screen that had tiny dots so that I could look at something, and I had to imagine the letter. So here basically you see an example of me looking at, in that case, is number 3. And what you see underneath is my kind of how the eye would read that letter. And then I'm trying to, of course, try to rebuild the letter when parts are missing, or I try to imagine this letter on a blank screen. So these are some of the results. And basically these are the connections between the dots. Like as I said, the eye moves really quickly. So this machine is capable to really record precisely this movement that they call saccades. So that's one of these outputs that is called saccades, where it measures the movement of the eye. And here on the right, you see another output that is called fixation points. That means how long did I look at each part of a letter? So what actually makes a letter a letter? Like what are the parts in a letter form that are important for us to read it as a letter form? Here's some more example of an X. I also did numbers. And then a last output was area of interest. So the more red the color is, the longer I look there. So this is basically me imagining these letters or trying to draw these letters out of memory. And this was basically the output with this area of interest. And what I found fascinating here is that I was actually able to see the letters in the output. So while I was looking, I didn't see anything, but then later I got the output and it was actually, it really resembles an A, a B, a C, a D. So whatever I was trying to imagine on that blank screen actually was recording some sort of a thing that turned out as a letter. And then from these fixation points, I created this alphabet that, was also fascinated that it actually worked. Just trying to see where are the parts of the letter that I kept looking at the longest. And it turned out that it looked like something like a font or a typeface. Now I want to give a really brief intro to typography. And I think it's good that you maybe hear some of there are going to be a lot of new terms and you can forget about them. But it's good if you hear them for once, because you never know, maybe in the future you're gonna, you want to try something out, you want to look on something on the internet, and then you maybe remember the term and it's easier. So typography is the art and technique of arranging type to make written language legible. So it's really about it's really about differentiating a form from something that becomes meaning, like a letter form, like an alphabet. And it's important that typography has a huge influence over the visual impact of a message, and it sets the tone and it sets the mood for the reader. And the digital fonts we use today often have incredible origin stories. So it all kind of started a long time ago. And so here's an example from Mesopotamia. That was like in the 2nd century. They found this rock, or this looks like a stamp or a seal. And they carved little signs in it, and they use it as a form of printing. And again, the alphabet is a fundamental part of our interactions, and the type designer or graphic designer works within a multitude of subtle variations to create meaning from a letter form. And these were found in like Mesopotamia today is like Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Kuwait, in this area where a lot of these oldest forms of what we would call today a letter form found. And then if we jump ahead a lot of thousands of years, we find these hand letterings in the Bibles, especially in around the 12th, 14th century in Europe. They were often practiced by monks. And there were these like, what was really fascinating about them is that they had these historated initials, which were often like, would tell a story. It's like a letter form with a, here it's like, on the right you see Peter in this big P, and it would always kind of accompany the text. Like nowadays, what would you say? I mean, can't really compare. Can't say that it's really like nowadays a meme, but you have like an image that accompanies text or contrasts text, and would help understand the text. And the downside, of course, of this very elaborate handwritten lettering was that it was very costly. So somebody had to write this the whole day, and it wasn't there was barely any distribution. Only rich people, wealthy people could afford one of these Bibles. So it was very limited, the access was very limited. And of course, information is power. And so it was kind of only circulating in church, and people could read, and those were mostly wealthy people. So you could say that was the downside of these very elaborate Bible hand letterings. And then if we jump again into the 15th centuries, the German inventor and goldsmith Johannes Gutenberg invented the letterpress printing, how we call it today. That's basically movable parts that are made out of metal or lead, that are tiny, tiny parts. So every letter is on one stick. And by putting them together, you could actually then form an alphabet. And that was, of course, revolutionary at the time, because you could multiply things. You could multiply texts. You could send them around, and people would get more familiar, would be able to pick up reading quicker, and you could multiply whatever you wanted to say. So that was a huge, huge revolution. So here you see a close-up of how letterpress is used today, how I used to use it. Basically, you have to place these single letters. It's a lot of work. It's time intensive, labor intensive. You have to place them on a board, and then once everything is fixed, you can then apply a layer of ink and then go over it with the paper. And what's also interesting is that these measurements that you see here that were used for metal type are now translated into the digital measurements. So they're really, that's the origin of how type is also set today online. So the measurements from these parts are also translated. Is there anything I wanted to say here? Oh, and yeah, the amazing thing is, of course, jumping again, when we look at post-war, we had things coming like typewriters, of course, that were also helped. We didn't need a whole workshop situation and like all these presses. We could use a simple typewriter machine to write letters, to write, whatever we wanted to say. And that helped, of course, as well to distribute information. And that's kind of, there is also another important kind of, an important, I could say, invention. That was the Typeface Helvetica that was designed by Max Miedinger in the 50s. And this was kind of revolutionary because it was the first really widely used sans serif typeface. I'm going to explain in a second what that is. It has no diagonals, and it was widely used for brands like if you think about Verizon or Cheap or American Apparel, these are all brands that used Helvetica. It was widely used. It's used for road signs all over the world. It's used for airports. And it's when it came out, it was like a boom. Everyone wanted to use it. It was said as like the most readable font because it works really well on labels, on disclaimers in like a very small size. So that was kind of a important important step. And then if we go into how these things nowadays are being used, of course, we mostly use Type Digital. And that was the first typeface that was used online, or on a computer using points of light. It's called DigiGrotesque, and it basically works with like a bit in a bitmap format, saying like what is here green would be a light and what is black is no light. So it's like a pixel font, you would say today almost. And yeah, that kind of brings us into today. And what is so great about that is that nowadays anybody with access kind of to a vector design software or to super simple like a Word document or something can create your own font. It's not something that is only for certain people with certain professions. It's something that is way more accessible now, also all the different fonts. And you might have noticed that if you use, let's say, Times New Roman to write something, or Arial, that you have different weights per family. And here on the left, you have them kind of listed out. It goes from thin to black. And these are just ways to, emphasize or highlight or create a hierarchy on the page. Like, let's say, bold is often used for a title. Italics is used if you want to quote something. So there are different types of information are set in different typefaces. But of course, these are not written in stone. Like, you can write a title however you want it nowadays. But for certain things, like if you write an academic essay, there might be restrictions on what way to use. And then some fonts also have a condensed cut, which means that the letters are really squeezed together. The kerning, that's basically the space between the letters, is super tight. Or we have the opposite, that extended, it's super wide and has a lot of white space. And I mentioned the word serif before, and you might have noticed this in text you read. So there are these things we call serif, that are these little feet that are at the end of the letters, like let's say here at the T. We also call the ones up here serif. So it's everything that kind of peeks out, and it makes the letter stand. And the eye kind of has more to grasp on. So if you kind of look quickly over it, you see that there is a lot for the eye to look at, whether here it's kind of more naked, if you will. So, and sans serif fonts are also called grotesque fonts. So there are two versions to name those. And there is a lot of variety. Type history is very long, so there's a lot of things that happened. We just looked at Helvetica, that's a sans serif. Here, this example, it's this typeface called Myriad. Then there are also, within the serif fonts, there are different ones. There are modern ones, transitional, old style. We have script that are mostly handwritten. We have something called black letter that was often used. You saw in the human initials in Bibles. We have display fonts. That's something you see in the subway a lot. Monospaced is more something that is that you might be familiar from like a typewriter. Monospace also means that every letter has the exact same width, which is kind of unique. And then you have something funky that is called dingbat, which is a list of symbols. So a typeface could also be a list of symbols, almost like hieroglyphs. And we have slab serif up here. Sorry, I forgot though. I forgot that. So we classify fonts into different so-called, it's like a way of classifying. So we know when I say someone, oh, do you want to use a script typeface? The person knows what I mean when I talk about script. So it's a way to communicating between a designer or a client, and that just helps to kind of know what we're talking about. And of course, very briefly or very simplified said, a serif typeface, what we said has these little feet, is often used in novels for longer texts. And that has to do that it's less, it's easier for the eye to stay on it than if this whole text would be in a sans serif font. And that's nowadays controversial. Like some people say, no, sans serif is better to read. I personally think that a serif is better to read. I mean, you can test it yourself. If you have a really long document you have to read and it's a sans serif typeface, do you get exhausted quicker? And of course, for screens, it's also a bit different. So when we think about a text message, how we use it on our iPhones or wherever, it's often a sans serif typeface because in smaller sizes, it's easier to read. So there are pros and cons when using a serif typeface rather than using a sans serif. But that's really, I think nowadays that the retina screen is so like brilliantly precise and goes so into detail that nowadays you will also discover on a lot of websites that they use a serif typeface and vice versa. Their books from eFlux are mostly set in a sans serif. So there is, nowadays you see both, but it's really a bit after your personal taste. But yeah, that's just something to keep in mind. What is the artifact that you're producing, and how, what's your audience? You know, if you design something for older people, maybe, you know, that might need to be a little bit bigger, and they maybe prefer serif and so on. So that's really up to you. And then we have some font metrics. So when we talk about a typeface, or when we look more into detail, there are things that we look at. So for example, a typeface always sits on a baseline. And when we look at a lowercase letter like the P, H, I, and X here, they all have a common X height. So they're kind of aligning somewhere. That also helps the reader to kind of realize that these letters are actually building a word and are not just something else. And then we have a cap height for the capital letters. And sometimes that goes into detail. We have, you know, an O and an S, they go a little around above the baseline, above the cap height. So they appear optically at the same size.
So good to see all this structure beneath the font.
Yeah.
And to hear the controversies of typography. I was just wondering if anyone is throwing a lot at you, just as a general overview, if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, feel free to ask anytime. I think this is an interesting, this is so simple, but it's so essential. You know, sometimes people really want to see it in a certain way. They're like, this really has to be, I really want to see this text in sans serif. I really want to see it in serif. So it's really, it really depends on who you're designing for, who you're designing with. And yeah, it's a super interesting choice and always sparks a lot of discussion amongst designers and the people you work with. And then we could even go more granular and look at the anatomy of all these letter forms that we encounter daily. So they have really funny names. So the belly of the O is called the counter. We have the bowl and the chi. We have the T is called bar. The R is called shoulder. So you see there are a lot of, some of the words are like kind of coming from, it's on your shoulder though, but some are kind of actually coming from the human body or naming things in the human body. In German, we call some things like shoe or foot. So it's interesting how the naming happens. And when talking about a typeface, it helps to be like, oh, know what these things are named, so you're quicker. The communication is more precise.
Julie, we have a great question in the chat. If you go back to that previous one,
I did
would you
not.
use similar structures? Oh no, it was just put in there. Or ways of describing it for numbers? In other words, the same method.
For numbers.
Mm-hmm.
That
or
was this slide, right?
Glyphs, numbers, all the other characters.
Yes, exactly. So when you, I'll go back. So when you design an entire typeface, of course, the brackets, the question mark, the comma, the numbers, all also has to kind of fit into the system that you create for your specific typeface. So yes, then we also use the baseline. We also use the cap height. Of course, if the numbers go all the way up, then we also use the cap height and so on. So the system throughout an entire typeface stays the same. It's not being changed. That's a really good question. And then big question that a lot of students ask me is, where do I actually get those fonts? Like, I know I have some on, when I open Google Docs or when I open a Word document, there are already fonts embedded. And these are very established fonts. They're mostly, they're not from the 2020s. They're mostly a bit older. And there are different ways to find typefaces. So for example, you can look at a website called My Fonts. There is also a great Type Foundries archive that has listed different type foundries by country. So you can see what countries are producing what. And it's often like 2 or 3 people who run a type design foundry, and they distribute their fonts online. And on this website, myfonts.com, for example, you can purchase fonts. You can also purchase web fonts. And, they're sometimes, really affordable, like $10. And then it goes up if you want to purchase a whole family, a whole type family for like something, for a bigger brand, then it might get really expensive. So there is a big range. And Google Fonts has actually really, really great fonts that you can embed and use. So there is a lot going on in the last even 2-3 years. There's been a huge push in digitizing fonts and making them available online. So if you dig a bit, you find amazing things. So just to say there are free versions, but there are also things that are that have a price. And how do I make a typeface? There are different ways. Of course, you can just draw it, you can draw it and then put it together. That can be super rudimental. Or you can use a software. In this case, I use RoboFont. It's I think they have free trial versions for students online. It's basically a software that then when I press on the keyboard, the A, it actually outputs the A that I want. So I kind of have to say A equal, the letter form, or let's say I would want my co-O as the O I type. I have to put a vector file into the O within the RoboFont file, and then I can export it as a font file. So there are sometimes more difficult, sometimes more simple ways of digitizing a font. And yeah, now Mark and I just put together some examples. These we talked already about, these human initials, where they were used in the 12th to 15th century, where the initials or the start of a paragraph was illustrated. There are these really beautiful examples here from a Dutch type designer. I don't know if you would call it in the 17th century also type designer, but he drew these wonderful, very expressive letter forms that have, like, you discover a human face, or like part of a plant, or some sort of like monster creature from the 17th century. Or things like this, where the letters are plants, and you see these animals interact with the letter form, or there's like a pear hanging down. So it's really, really, really delicate and beautifully drawn. Of course, you also had more like funny examples. That's the comical hodgepodge, which is this character who formed with the body the different letter forms. Or here another drawing. And then we have we collected some more contemporary examples. Here this is cut out of, it's hard to read, but it's kind of interesting. It's cut out of a magazine, I assume, or out of photographs or photocopies, and then kind of rearranged. Here, of course, something, somebody made like strings out of flowers, or a toast alphabet by biting off the corners, and the restriction is that you just have the shape of the toast. So it's an interesting, very simple, expressive alphabet. Then this is a poster that is made out of taking a scan or a photograph of the book, but from the top, by bending it and creating these letter forms. I think it's really interesting. Here an example where somebody cut out little stripes and was hanging them, and then put the light, so the shadow it casts makes it actually legible. I think that's also kind of a 3D, like a handmade 3D version. This is by for a jazz festival by a graphic designer called Niklaus Troxler. He just dripped ink and formed these letters, and sometimes, they almost disappear, becomes more like a camouflage of dots, and then sometimes you realize that they're actually letters. This is an example that we found interesting because it's made out of one kind of stroke. It's kind of hard to say what it was made out of, if it's made digitally or if somebody actually placed something, but they're interesting forms that are, of course, kind of hard to read, but interesting forms. Here, that's probably made, I was like, is this like is this maybe drawn with closed eyes, or is this with like a brush and like, or on a little rope or something? It was interesting. That's a typeface you see here on the cover that a friend of mine did. She was drawing these letters, but kind of looking away. So she just kind of had a piece of paper in front of her, and she was looking away and tried to draw the letter. So then these kind of really really fine letters came out. I think it's really beautiful. These are typefaces from a friend of mine who was a chemical engineer before he started design, and he made letter forms out of as a chemical engineering software. So he's really interested in kind of misusing existing software, which is also super fun. Like you could, he also did one in the inside a video game. He was drawing letters, and so it's a very, you can get very creative. Um, these are some 3D rendered examples here. These are these balloons for Stefan Sagmeister's show, or here it's made out of like digital water almost-ish. This I think is a really interesting example of a combination of existing typography, like the WER is I think is an existing typeface, and then it's being combined with pieces that are photographed or kind of found, and then just kind of pieced together as letter forms. And it's, of course, here it's German. It says Werkschau, but it's still legible. So it plays really with the perception of what is legible and what becomes just an image.
And Juliet, these are so good. Super exciting. And I see like a lot of like people nodding their heads. I just wanted to note that we have 30 minutes in the class. So
okay, I'm gonna jump over this quickly.
I don't think we have that many more. Just timekeeping.
Thank you. Yeah, so here we have tape. Here it's a fence where the type was placed into the fence, which is super interesting. This is a typeface I made inspired by this utopian architect, Arthur Kohara, who I wanted to do something that is stretched. So I had very limited things at home at the time. So I had this shelf, these two cans, and these stockings. So I used the shelf as my, if you could say so, baseline grid and cap height, and try to make a typeface out of this that works with something heavy, stretching a fabric. That's kind of the output of the typeface that I used then for a publication where I collected things that my friends of mine were currently reading. So you see the typeface here is in some sort of bookmark, and here's some other example how it was used for pull quotes. These are some other examples, and yeah, I think we can start with our first exercise.